spite of the wildly strange party currently raging inside the shadow wheels, Phrog and his novices, who were safely sleeping in their protective cyberpods, soon were delivered to the outer level of the deep room. And as quickly as Phrog could manage, he and his novices were moved from the shadow wheels into the elevator, which led to the second level of the deep room. No sooner than the elevator doors had closed, Phrog, who had been anticipating this very anxiously, heard a small series of muffled explosions. These being, of course, the consequences of the combination of the now highly saturated petroleum distillates within the shadow wheels and several possible sources of sparking or igniting. And, although it was perhaps a small victory in a meaningless battle, Phrog had once again avoided being exploded by the shadows during one of their wildly strange petroleum refining and bong distilling parties. More importantly, not only were Phrog and his novices safe, but also Phrog's bongo drums were safe. And while novices certainly were more important to Phrog than his bongo drums, he was nevertheless a bit fond of his bongos, and therefore was quite pleased that they had survived yet another shadow party. As the elevator slowly descended to the second level of the deep room, Phrog studied the security monitors very carefully and, using his highly customized mind-machine interface, began to query the security system regarding every important parameter, measurement, and observation pertaining to the safety, isolation, and inner workings of the deep room. Even though each of Phrog's deep rooms had highly elaborate security systems that spanned many dimensions, so long as Ilgon Ilgo continued virtually to be obsessed with its most unusual and puzzling desire to steal Ogly Nogly's beautiful black high-heel slippers with cute ankle straps and open toes, there simply were no truly safe havens from anything in the very high dimensions, because Ilgon Ilgo had discovered how to make ripples in the space-time tunnel, albeit only from the outside, not from the inside. Just as Ogly Nogly had its beautiful slipper, which actually was a most marvelous space-time vehicle, so did Ilgon Ilgo have a beautiful slipper. In fact, these two slippers were a pair, but the cobbler who made them was very careful to make each one just a little bit differently. And it was the differences in the two slippers which, when put to good use, enhanced the abilities of the slippers. However, because the cobbler fully understood the potential abilities of this pair of truly marvelous slippers, when operated in tandem, one slipper was a tiny bit more powerful than the other, and it was the more powerful slipper that Ogly Nogly controlled. Ilgon Ilgo's slipper certainly was powerful, but it was no match for Ogly Nogly's slipper. In the early moments when the space-time tunnel first was set in motion, Ogly Nogly and Ilgon Ilgo were a duality that, in toto, comprised a functionality and authority which later became to be known as the keepers of the space-time tunnel, and even later transferred entirely to Ogly Nogly, who then became the sole keeper of the space-time tunnel. And in those early moments, which were long before anyone had imagined such marvelous things as a beautiful pair of black high-heel slippers with cute ankle straps and open toes, the state-of-the-art in cobbling was a simple pair of sandals, functional, comfortable, and conveniently airy. Ogly Nogly worked the inside of the space-time tunnel, while Ilgon Ilgo worked the outside of the space-time tunnel. Occasionally, they traveled in tandem, but most of the time they worked independently to maintain the stability of the space-time tunnel. As time passed, which in the early moments happened very quickly, the cobbler increased his skill in cobbling and soon realized that the finest pair of shoes were a pair of black high-heel slippers with cute ankle straps and open toes, at least for the work the keeper of the space-time tunnel needed to do. while sandals and then boots certainly were functional. As the cobbler carefully began assembling the beautiful pair of slippers, in a true instance of brilliance, the cobbler understood what would likely happen in the far distant future so clearly that he foresaw the need for one of the beautiful slippers to be able to do something the other one would never be able to do. In some respects, this extra ability was a small and insignificant thing, but in other respects, it was the one thing which, if it were possible, and this appeared to be very likely, would make it possible sometime in the far distant future to be able to prevent a little mistake in the design and construction of the space-time tunnel from becoming a big mistake, one which otherwise might eventually lead to the collapse of the space-time tunnel. In the grand scheme of the space-time tunnel, by design, the real battle of good and evil was being waged primarily over control of Ogly Noggly's beautiful slipper. Because whoever or whatever controlled Ogly Noggly's beautiful slipper ultimately would control the space-time tunnel, and whoever or whatever controlled the space-time tunnel also controlled space-time itself. In a curious and perhaps puzzling way, the tiny difference in the two beautiful slippers was very simple. Specifically, Ogly Noggly's beautiful slipper had a glove compartment, and inside this glove compartment, which only Ogly Noggly's beautiful slipper had, was a little black book that fully described and clearly explained everything the beautiful slippers did, including how to maintain them and how to operate the various levers, both visible and invisible. But the key bit of information found in the little book, stored conveniently inside the glove compartment of Ogly Noggly's beautiful slipper, was hidden on the last page of the little book underneath the words, "This page intentionally left blank." Of course, Phrog knew nothing about the glove compartment of Ogly Noggly's beautiful slipper, the little black book, or the secret of the last page. But he certainly knew what happened when Ilgon Ilgo created ripples in the space-time tunnel. And Phrog had no intention of being anywhere near any place where Ilgon Ilgo was creating ripples. As a time thread pilot, Phrog used only a few of the infinite number of time threads that the space-time tunnel spanned. And while he could only perceive occasional glimpses of Ogly Noggly and Ilgon Ilgo, he was aware of them, as were all beings and life forms in one way or another. If he was doing something good and Ogly Noggly was in the area, then it became better. But if he was doing something bad and Ilgon Ilgo was around, then it became worse. And since Phrog tended to be a bit of a scoundrel most of the time, he simply did not need more problems than the ones he either already had or was busily creating. At times, this bothered Phrog deeply, but perhaps since Phrog was a bit slow in some respects, his general response to being bothered entirely too much by philosophical thoughts was to play his bongo drums toward some goal of which Phrog simply had no idea or vision at present. As Phrog studied the information on the elevator's status display and continued to examine and to verify the operation of the deep room via his mind-machine interface, he became more comfortable in knowing that everything was in order and was functioning correctly in the deep room. Even though the elevator was very small in proportion to the shadow wheels, which to Phrog were huge, at least in the lower dimensions, where Phrog was no bigger than a tiny gumdrop or jelly bean, it was not so much the distance being traveled by the elevator as it descended toward the second level of the deep room that mattered. Rather, it was the dimensionality that was important. And while from one perspective, the elevator had traveled only a short distance in the lower dimensions from the outer level where the shadow wheels awaited, from another perspective, the elevator had traveled an enormous distance, not only in space, but also in time, in the higher dimensions.